Breaking news, FBI and DHS raid Michigan Port Director's office and 3.8 tons of drugs and millions seized. Now let's get into the details.
I still remember the exact moment everything shifted when a single radio transmission confirmed what none of us wanted to believe: Northern Michigan wasn't simply compromised. It had been quietly engineered into a fully functional cartel gateway. I had studied corruption cases before, but nothing prepared me for the scale of what unfolded in Traverse City. What was supposed to be a sleepy tourist harbor was in reality the front door to one of the most sophisticated smuggling pipelines ever uncovered on the Great Lakes. And as I stepped into that cold pre-dawn air on the morning the investigation broke open, I understood immediately that this story wasn't just about crime. It was about transformation, the kind that rots a region from the inside out. While law enforcement mapped the movement of the vessels, I turned my attention to the inland routes. I followed paper trails that seemed routine: fuel shipments, contractor invoices, equipment upgrades. But beneath those legitimate documents, I found coded references to what Whitford internally labeled the pipeline. It was not a metaphor. She had engineered a smuggling artery stretching deep into Michigan, leveraging remote fuel depots, fishing cabins, and even disused storage yards to distribute cartel product across 27 towns. The inland expansion wasn't just logistical, it was strategic. Smaller towns lacked the enforcement capacity to monitor sudden spikes in nighttime deliveries. Lakeside homes rented seasonally became ideal stash points. Warehouses that should have been filled with boats instead held boxes that smelled faintly of chemical solvents. At each location, the same pattern repeated: the shipments moved with quiet efficiency, supported by local distributors who had no idea how large the network truly was. But the most disturbing revelation came when mapping distribution routes alongside overdose data. The lines matched. Every spike in meth and counterfeit pills converged with the roads feeding out from the receiving zones. Teachers had been right. The Northern supply was too abundant, too cheap, too constant. I interviewed local dealers under federal custody, and many described the Northern product as flood level, as if it poured into the region like water breaking a dam. As I pieced everything together, I understood why the collapse had gone unnoticed for so long. Whitford had built her system around silence: quiet codes, quiet approvals, quiet documents, quiet bribes. Nothing happened with fanfare. Nothing drew attention. Her genius was not in how she moved product, it was in how she made the extraordinary look mundane. A port director adjusting schedules routine, a contractor upgrading fuel lines ordinary, a Coast Guard officer waving through a vessel unremarkable. Yet every small silent action added up to an empire. By the end of that day, staring down at maps covered in red arrows and coded notes, I finally grasped the truth. Whitford's network didn't just move drugs, it shaped the region's rhythms, its traffic, its nightlights, its shoreline patterns, even the pace of life in towns miles inland. The water, the docks, the back roads, the forests, they all pulsed with the same hidden heartbeat, and if we were going to shut it down, we'd have to match her precision step for step and chase her pipeline back to its source. When the dust finally settled from the financial analysis, a different task awaited us, one that carried a heavier emotional weight than the raids, the firefights, or the forensic spreadsheets. It was time to measure the real-world damage, the human fallout left behind by Whitford's empire. I had braced myself for bad numbers, for bleak reports, for the predictable consequences of a cartel pipeline operating unchecked for years. But nothing prepared me for the sheer scale of the collapse that had taken root across northern Michigan. It wasn't just crime statistics or overdoses. It was a social unraveling, a community slowly hollowed out from the inside while no one realized what was happening. The first signs surfaced through public health data collected over the last 3 years. The trend line looked impossible. Overdose incidents had surged 310% across the Grand Traverse region. And these weren't isolated to troubled neighborhoods or city centers. Small towns, rural districts, fishing villages, and retirement communities all showed parallel spikes. EMS teams described responding to overdoses in places that had never seen drug activity before: gas station bathrooms, boat docks, school parking lots, even the edges of quiet hiking trails. It became clear why. Whitford's shipments were not staying at the port. They were dispersing outward in a meticulously constructed web carried by local distributors who had no shortage of product and no competition to drive prices up. The Northern supply was cheap, potent, and constant, an irresistible combination for individuals already vulnerable to addiction. But the most heartbreaking revelations emerged from the region's schools. 7 high schools across northern Michigan reported unprecedented drug incidents. Teachers described pills circulating through hallways as casually as energy drinks. Administrators told us about lockers that smelled of chemical residue, about students whose behavior changed so drastically that parents assumed they were dealing with mental health crises. In reality, many of those teenagers had become early victims of Whitford's pipeline. When I sat across from educators who had spent their careers trying to protect young people, I saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the frustration of fighting a threat they didn't even know existed until it overwhelmed them. At the same time, the region was struggling under a second crisis, an influx of rehabilitation inmates relocated from other counties, a policy meant to ease overcrowding elsewhere. Whitford's network exploited them ruthlessly. Many arrived with no stable housing, no support structure, and no job prospects. They were ideal targets for recruitment. Some became runners, others served as decoys. A few were funneled into the casino laundering chain, paid in small amounts of product rather than cash. They were victims first, criminals second, and casualties either way. The first warning came at 3 a.m. when an expedited entry shipping container raised quiet suspicion among port staff. I was nearby when agents cracked the seal and the metallic scent of chemical powder hit before the doors even fully opened. Inside were neatly stacked bundles, 200 kilograms of fentanyl, 500 kilograms of meth, and 62 kilograms of heroin, enough to devastate entire communities. Even more alarming was the industrial GPS jamming module mounted beside the crates, a piece of equipment designed to make vessels disappear from Coast Guard tracking. That was the moment I knew we weren't looking at an isolated breach. This was infrastructure purpose-built, well-funded, and deeply embedded. Every crate bore the unmistakable seal of the Sinaloa cartel, but the cold shock came from the paperwork tucked beneath the manifest. Every signature, clearance code, and expedited routing pointed to one person, Port Director Dana Whitford. The effects bled into everyday life. Small motels near highway corridors saw surges in late-night activity. Lakefront vacation homes, once innocent symbols of summer tourism, were quietly converted into stash houses. Convenience stores reported theft spikes. Local police departments, understaffed and unprepared, found themselves dealing with a wave of crime they couldn't explain. The sheriffs I spoke to described it as pressure without a source, a kind of invisible weight on the region that none of them realized had been orchestrated from the port director's office. What struck me the hardest was how normal everything still looked on the surface. Families still walked the shoreline. Tourists still snapped pictures of the bay. Shops still opened their doors at dawn. But beneath that peaceful facade, an entire region had been quietly weakened. Its schools destabilized, its law enforcement overwhelmed, its public health system strained, and its small towns turned into micro hubs of cartel distribution. By the end of those 48 hours of analysis, a grim truth emerged. Northern Michigan had not been corrupted by accident. It had been systematically reshaped. Whitford didn't just smuggle drugs, she engineered a regional collapse, one decision at a time. One unreported shipment, one reassigned officer, one falsified inspection, one quiet bribe. When I looked across the conference room at the maps, charts, and testimonies spread across the tables, I realized that the damage she caused would take years, perhaps decades, to unwind. And yet, despite the devastation, I felt something else too, a growing sense of resolve. If a single person could cause this much harm in silence, then perhaps a determined community with eyes open and safeguards restored could rebuild louder, stronger, and more resilient than before. As federal teams prepared their final briefings, I found myself standing beside a wall-sized map of northern Michigan, each pin marker and red line representing a piece of Whitford's empire. Hours earlier, this room had pulsed with urgency. Now it felt strangely quiet, as if the region itself were holding its breath. The raids were over, the financial networks had been exposed, the distribution hubs were dismantled. But in that silence, another realization surfaced, one that unsettled me more than the cartel's violence or the scale of the smuggling. Northern Michigan had survived the operation, yes, but the warning it carried stretched far beyond any single port officer or criminal pipeline. What happened here was a mirror for the entire country. I kept replaying the same question in my mind. How did one person manage to engineer an entire cartel gateway without anyone noticing for 4 years? The answer wasn't found in the drugs, or the money, or the GPS jammers. It was found in something far more dangerous: trust. The kind communities give freely to people in positions of authority. The kind that lets paperwork pass without scrutiny. The kind that allows small procedural changes to accumulate until they form a structure no one recognizes. Corruption doesn't announce itself with alarms. It whispers. It slides into routine. It hides behind job titles and polished offices. Whitford understood that perfectly, and she weaponized it. As I reviewed the evidence, patterns emerged that felt eerily familiar, not to this region, but to dozens of small communities across America. Ports struggling with staffing shortages, inspection units overwhelmed with complex protocols, casinos handling massive cash flow with minimal oversight, rural law enforcement facing resource gaps. Each vulnerability alone seemed manageable, but combined they formed the perfect conditions for an infiltration like the one Whitford built. Her empire wasn't an anomaly, it was a blueprint, and that was the most haunting realization of all. I remember walking outside to the overlook behind the command center, where Lake Michigan stretched out like a sheet of cold steel. The shoreline looked peaceful, almost untouched. Tour boats bobbed quietly in the distance. It was hard to reconcile that serene landscape with the knowledge of what had been operating beneath it. But corruption, I had learned, never disrupts the surface until it's too late. It grows in the shadows inside overlooked departments, unnoticed operations, and unchallenged authority. And if Northern Michigan could be transformed so thoroughly, so silently, what did that mean for other ports, other communities, other regions that never expected to be targets? Standing there, I found myself thinking not just about the past 4 years, but about the next 4. What safeguards would be built? What blind spots would be corrected? How many other places were already compromised without realizing it? These weren't hypothetical questions, they were warnings. Every part of Whitford's network existed because someone trusted her enough not to look, not to ask, not to question, and that more than anything was the danger. As the final data streams were compiled, one truth stood above all others. Northern Michigan hadn't just been exploited, it had been engineered. Every bribe, every falsified inspection, every shell company, every clearance code, each one was a deliberate piece of a larger design. She didn't create chaos, she created order, a cartel statelet hidden beneath the veneer of a peaceful lakeside region. And though Operation Northern Breakwater had shut it down, it also exposed a reality we could no longer ignore. Within minutes, federal teams stormed her office. What I saw inside felt less like an administrative space and more like a crisis command center built for a criminal organization. Waterproof suitcases stuffed with 2.3 million, 14 restricted access cards tied to unidentified individuals, a loaded 9mm pistol placed almost casually on her desk. But it was the documents that chilled me most: map schedules and internal memos outlining what she publicly described as an inland fuel pipeline expansion. In reality, it was a covert smuggling artery pushing cartel product into the interior of Michigan. I realized then that Whitford hadn't merely facilitated drug shipments, she had redesigned the region's entire maritime ecosystem and weaponized it. Before leaving the command center that night, I took one last look at the evidence board photos of seized vessels, casino transaction logs, encrypted chats, school reports, overdose maps. It struck me that every item represented 2 stories, one of destruction and one of survival. Communities had been damaged, but they hadn't been defeated. The region had been infiltrated, but now it was awake. And for the first time in years, people were seeing the machinery that had operated behind their everyday lives. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I understood that the true battle wasn't just against cartels or corruption. It was against complacency, the quiet belief that it can't happen here. Because Northern Michigan proved that it can, anywhere. And the next safeguard would not come from a raid or an investigation. It would come from vigilance, from communities willing to question the familiar, and from systems forced to confront their blind spots before someone else exploited them. The operation was over, but the lesson was just beginning. What unfolded in Northern Michigan was more than a criminal takedown. It was a revelation of how deeply corruption can infiltrate a community when left unchecked. The investigation began with a single suspicious container, but quickly widened into one of the most complex cartel operations ever uncovered in the region. Over 4 years, Port Director Dana Whitford engineered a covert trafficking pipeline that transformed a peaceful harbor into a strategic smuggling gateway. Through bribed Coast Guard officers, falsified clearance codes, and meticulously planned shipping schedules, she created secret nighttime receiving zones and maritime corridors that allowed cartel vessels to move undetected. Yet the physical shipments were only half the story. Whitford built a parallel financial empire that laundered more than $160 million through tribal casinos, shell companies, and disguised consulting payments. Funds were cycled between Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Mexico in a seamless loop that resembled corporate logistics more than criminal activity. Her influence spread through infrastructure casinos and regional business networks, embedding cartel interests into the local economy. The social consequences were devastating. Overdose rates surged, 310% high schools reported widespread circulation of counterfeit pills, and vulnerable rehabilitation inmates were absorbed into distribution chains. Law enforcement agencies struggled under unexplained rises in theft, violence, and drug incidents. Entire towns became micro-hubs in a distribution network they never realized existed. Whitford had not just enabled crime, she had engineered a regional breakdown, quietly reshaping public health education and community safety. Operation Northern Breakwater dismantled this empire through simultaneous raids across 41 locations involving more than 600 agents. The takedown exposed the full architecture of Whitford's design, culminating in her arrest near Torch Lake. But even as the region began recovering, a broader warning emerged: the vulnerabilities exploited in northern Michigan exist nationwide. Ports, casinos, understaffed agencies, and small towns across America could be similarly targeted. The true message of this operation is clear: corruption grows in silence, thrives in trust, and spreads through the unnoticed corners of everyday systems. The collapse of Whitford's network is both a victory and a cautionary tale, a reminder that vigilance, transparency, and proactive oversight are the only defenses against hidden infrastructures capable of reshaping entire regions. The more we dug into her 4-year tenure, the clearer the picture became. She had quietly crafted secret nighttime receiving zones around Grand Traverse Bay areas that lined up perfectly with unusual Coast Guard vessel logs and unexplained shoreline maintenance lights. It wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration. Whitford paid monthly bribes to Coast Guard officers, creating a fast lane through which cartel vessels bypassed hours of inspections in mere minutes. Some were cleared in under 7. No wonder the northern supply chain had grown so rapidly. Everything about her operation was engineered for efficiency and invisibility. But what struck me hardest wasn't the logistics, it was the human damage hidden beneath them. As we interviewed residents across the region, the story darkened. 7 high schools reported an alarming spike in meth and counterfeit pills among teenagers, some barely old enough to drive. Overdose cases in small towns had surged 310% in 3 years. Teachers described students whose personalities changed overnight. Parents wept as they recounted discovering pills in backpacks, bedrooms, and gym lockers. I began to see Whitford less as a corrupt official and more as the architect of a slow-motion collapse, one that spread through neighborhood schools and public health systems, like a toxin drifting silently across the water. Standing on the pier that morning watching agents secure the seized container, I realized that the breach wasn't just happening at the port. It had already seeped into the region's fabric. The shoreline, the casinos, the night docks, the fuel lines, everything was connected. This wasn't a scandal, it was a system, a hidden machine that had been running undetected for years. And as the investigations deepened, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: if we didn't uncover every part of Whitford's network, northern Michigan would never recover from what she built. As dawn crept across the water the morning after the initial breach, I found myself staring at the port's quiet shoreline, trying to process the enormity of what we had uncovered. But the truth was that the drugs in that container were only the visible tip of a far deeper structure. The real story, the one buried underneath layers of forged paperwork, altered logs, and corrupted maritime protocols, was hidden in the water itself. To understand the scale of Whitford's operation, I had to follow the currents she manipulated, and the deeper we traced those flows, the more I realized that northern Michigan hadn't simply been infiltrated. It had been redesigned to serve the needs of a cartel thousands of miles away. Investigators began by reconstructing vessel movements through Grand Traverse Bay, a task that should have been straightforward. Instead, we found patterns that made no sense for a legitimate port: nighttime offloading points marked by faint beams of maintenance lights along shorelines that rarely saw activity past sunset Coast Guard logs, showing vessels approved so quickly it defied protocol, and shipping schedules rearranged to create dark, unmonitored pockets of time. When I overlaid the maps, the shapes formed something unmistakable: a chain. 4 secret receiving zones positioned with mathematical precision, each aligned with secluded coves or industrial pockets where surveillance had been quietly reduced under Whitford's direction. But the real breakthrough came when the team analyzed clearance timestamps. Some vessels later confirmed to be carrying cartel cargo were approved in under 7 minutes. I'd reviewed hundreds of legitimate maritime inspections in my career, and not one had ever moved that fast. This wasn't neglect or laziness. It was choreography carried out with military-like discipline. Month after month, Whitford paid Coast Guard officers for early warnings, cleared channels, and inspection bypasses. But the most insidious part was how she embedded redundancy into her system. If one receiving zone became compromised, shipments could be rerouted through another, sometimes using small fishing boats retrofitted with concealed compartments.